Hello everyone, I'm Nitahone, and it is Friday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. I've done almost 90 of these, and most of them are based on the best cards in a particular category, based on research on how all the cards performed at Magic's highest level, and while those videos do pretty well, people most frequently request I do more videos on the worst cards in the game, and most of my most popular videos ever are on the worst cards in the game. Because of that, from now on, one MTG Top 10 a month will now be a worst video. In this installment, we're looking at the worst creatures to ever be printed. These are cards that were unplayable in their limited format, never played in any constructed deck that actually had a goal to win the game, and are only played in EDH by the most masochistic of people. I construct these lists based on a number of criteria. I look at how much cards cost, which are generally a good indicator of how terrible they are, especially if they are from a set from over 20 years ago and still worth nothing. And I look at how many people are playing the cards in EDH using EDH Rec. Being played very little in EDH is an excellent judge of a card's playability because it is such a diverse format. There are tons of cards that would normally not be great that actually have a home in EDH. That's not the case for any of the cards on this list, though. Obviously, none of these cards have seen play on the competitive scene either. Let's go ahead and get started with number 10. At number 10, we have Warping Worm. I actually really like the design here. Phasing is an interesting and complicated mechanic, that's why we've never seen it again. It essentially causes a card to alternate turns from actually existing on the battlefield and not existing on the battlefield. Warping Worm has an extra bad kind of phasing though, because even if it is on a turn where it should be phased in, you have to pay 4 mana to keep it from phasing out again. What's the payoff for dumping all this mana into it? It gets a +1/+1 counter every time it phases in, so sure, it can grow kind of quickly, but it starts at 1/1 for 4 mana. Again, I like the design on the card, but they certainly should have made its stats better if they wanted anyone to actually play it. Despite being over 20 years old, you can pick up a Phasing Worm for only 37 cents, and only 13 decks on EDH Rec run it. And most of those decks that do are basically running it as a joke, and decks like the aptly named Bad Card Tribal. As we will see, a lot of the decks playing creatures on this list are basically trolling us by intentionally playing terrible cards. At number 9, I have Devi, Steambeast. 5 mana for a 4/2 is just horrendous. So it better have a good text box, right? Well, it can regenerate. That's a good start, I guess. Oh, but it also allows your opponent to gain 2 life every single time it becomes tapped. So even if your opponent is completely defenseless, this 5 mana creature only manages to actually do 2 damage a turn. The beast is a little bit better as a blocker because of regeneration, but when a creature dies after using their regenerate ability, they return to the battlefield tapped, so no matter what you do, you're paying 5 mana for a horrendous attacker and a slightly better blocker. Of the 10 decks on EDH Rec running this thing, some of their names are My Life is Worthless and Facepalm, so again, even 10 is an inflated score for this card as many people are only running it as a joke. Next up, I have Viridian Scout. 4 mana for a 1/2 better have a good text box, right? Well, like with the Steambeast, we are left super underwhelmed. The Scout can kill small creatures with flying for an additional investment of 3 mana and sacrificing itself, so basically you pay a total of 7 mana to kill an X2 flyer. That is god-awful. It's a big problem with this card. Mediocre stats and an underwhelming ability for way too much mana. I mean, elves are one of the most popular tribes in Magic, but this doesn't even see play in elf tribal EDH decks because it's probably the worst elf ever printed. They could have given it more respectable stats or the ability to kill larger creatures with flying, and it still wouldn't be a very good card. It's just actually worth putting in a deck. Only 6 decks on EDH Rec have this card. Among them are decks named Golgari Bad Deck and Green Strictly Worse EDH. At number 7, we have another overcosted card. A 4 mana 1/1 flyer is just awful, and the text box here is terrible too. Paying 3 and discarding a card is not worth it for such a small stats boost. Yes, this card was printed in a block with the Madness mechanic, but there are countless better Madness enablers in the block. Many of them allow you to discard a card for free and come with better starting stats. This is another card to make deck lists for Bad Card Tribal and Facepalm, but it also sees play in Hall of Lame and White Strictly Worse EDH. At number 6, we have Mindless Null. A 3 mana 2/2 with a downside is just terrible. Usually when we see cards with downsides, they have impressive stats, and in Limited, we at least see 2 mana 2/2s with downsides, and these are usually playable, though not exciting. Sure, in this card's limited format, it theoretically could have been played in either zombie or vampire decks, which is an interesting use of the common slot by the design team, but seriously, why did they not make it a 2 mana 2/2? That would have taken this card from unplayable to a card you put in your limited deck frequently, actually, in the format where these creature types matter. Instead, this thing has probably never once seen a card sleeve. At number 5, we have another card that was too underpowered to be worth playing in its limited format. A creature with these stats and that activated ability would actually be playable if this was a 2-mana 2/1 who could regenerate for the same cost, or if you could regenerate it by just discarding a card, and none of that would make this card actually good, just the kind of card you begrudgingly play in limited. Instead, this was frequently the last card you would take out of a pack in Shards of Alara Limited. It is only in 2 decks on EDHREC, and that's a lot considering the number of people who run terrible cards just to run terrible cards, and the 2 decks that it shows up in on EDHREC are Bad Card Tribal and Literally the Worst. Those are their names. So it sees play in 0 EDH decks that actually plan on winning. At number 4, we have Mishras War Machine. Sure, it might see more play than any of the cards below it on this list, but I think it is actually worse than any of them are. A 7-mana 5/5 is already a horrible rate, and while this comes with a useful but confusing banding mechanic, which allowed it to attack and block in conjunction with one other creature, which in turn allowed you to choose how combat damage was divided, it comes with too much additional downside for it to be worth it. You have to discard a card or lightning bolt yourself in the face every upkeep, and not only that, it taps itself down if you don't discard the card. Also, what's going on with the art here? It looks like it is more likely to be taking Cinderella to the ball than helping anyone win in a war. At number 3, I have Jedit Janan, but it is a stand-in for several terrible vanilla legends from the Legends expansion. This was the first time Wizards printed gold cards, and you would think asking for multiple types of mana would make a card stronger, which is true today, but it doesn't seem to be the conclusion that Wizards reached at the time, as there are several severely overcosted legends whose stats are awful for the amount of mana and the multiple colors of mana that you need. The worst of them is Jedit Janan here, a 7-mana 5/5, but it is by no means the only terrible vanilla legend in the set. You also have Casimir the Lone Wolf, a 6-mana 5/3 that costs both blue and white, Barktooth Warbeard, a 7-mana 6/5 that costs both black and red, Lady Orca, a 7-mana 7/4 that costs both black and red, and Savitri Skarzum, a 7-mana 6/4 that costs both blue and black. Jedit Janan has one thing going for him, though, that none of those other cards have. He did get printed on another card that was actually good. Can't say the same for those other terrible cards. At number 2, I have Akron Legionnaire. An 8-mana 8/4 is already not stats you want. If something costs you 8 mana, it should probably put you in position to just win the game, and an 8/4 body isn't going to do that at all. But on top of that, it comes with massive downside. Only your artifact creatures can attack when it's in play, and itself. Yeah, that's bad. While it sees more play in EDH than any other card in this list, that's because people play this thing in some Zedru decks, where the whole point is to give your opponent this awful card. Even in those decks, though, it's not like it's a staple like some other terrible cards are. You have to get to 8 mana just to play this thing, and then you have to invest mana to give it to your opponent, and that is just awful. At number 1, we have a card that many people consider one of the worst cards ever, not just the worst creature, and that is Wood Elemental. This thing is just horrendous, laughably bad. It makes Akron Legionnaire look like Psychotog. So for 4 mana, you get to play a creature that only gets power and toughness equal to the number of forests you sacrifice. That doesn't seem too bad, right? I mean, it's bad, but not that bad. Not worst creature ever bad, right? Well, that would be true if it weren't for the fact that the lands you sacrifice have to be untapped forests. This means that any forest you tap to cast Wood Elemental cannot be sacrificed for it. This means if you try to just cast it for 4 mana and you have no other forest to sacrifice, you just paid 4 mana to put a card into your graveyard. For some reason, probably because it is so laughably bad, Wood Elemental is actually kind of expensive, costing around $10 to get a copy of it. I mean, I guess there is demand for owning the worst creature ever just to troll people. That does it for this week's MTG Top 10. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so others can enjoy it too. If you want to catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe. Also, my Top 10s are sponsored by 5colorcombo.com. You can use my discount code NEEDSAHONE5 in their store to get a 5% discount on awesome products like playmats and tokens by Magic artists. Thanks for watching.